relations, from partners to competitors and back. A theme which suggests much. It's an accurate description of various phases of American policy, as well as a long period starting at least in '72 in the post-war era. And it's one that, among other things, suggests the possibilities of or illustrates the two great currents historically of American foreign policy, the current of realism on one hand and idealism on the other. We're very fortunate to have addressed that topic, one of the nation's foremost China experts, Professor Harry Harding, Dean of the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. Professor Harding is a graduate of Princeton University, master's and PhD degrees from Stanford. He taught at Stanford and then Swarthmore before joining the Brookings Institution in their foreign policy program. At GW, he has a number of specializations: domestic Chinese affairs, Chinese foreign policy, the international relations of East Asia, and U.S.-China foreign policies. Among his books have been one on bureaucracy, a second on reform after Mao, and the third, directly relevant to this particular topic, U.S.-China relations, '72 to approximately '92. As I say, Professor Harding is one of the nation's foremost authorities in this matter. It's a wonderful topic. China is probably a little more important than U.S.-China relations in the long run, a great power which is becoming even greater. It's my great pleasure to present Professor Harry Harding.
Thank you very much, Frank, and good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for turning out. This is a terrific turnout. I'm going to have to really turn both to right and to left to make sure that I see everybody. It's a cold evening, and yet it's a packed house, and I'm delighted to be here. Frank, I think, was maybe a little too pessimistic when he did his very subtle appeal for fundraising and then wondered how many people who clapped would actually give. Because I can already tell in three ways that this is a very extraordinary organization. Number one, while Frank and I were chatting at the front door, one of the members came in for the program and basically acknowledged that he had no idea who the speaker was and no idea what the program was about, but he was here. And that basically is the greatest tribute that any Council on Foreign Affairs can ever have. Basically, the members are saying, if you organize it, it's worth coming to. And so that's number one. Number two was that all of a sudden, while we were chatting and having a drink, the reception area emptied and the chairs filled because the audience just knows without being told that it's time to get serious. And then lo and behold, here we are starting at 6 o'clock on time. So this is an extraordinary organization. So Frank, I think you may be surprised at how many people contribute to it, because they obviously think an awful lot of it, and I hope I don't disappoint them. This is probably, and I think when I spoke here last time I said the same thing, this is probably the most difficult venue for any speaker, second only to the University of Virginia. Because when I look up at the audience, I just see this incredible view of Baltimore stretched out before me. Similarly, if you speak in the central building at the University of Virginia, you look past the audience to a view of Mr. Jefferson's yard. And in each case, it's extraordinarily difficult to keep your mind on the topic at hand. So I hope you know what a challenge you present to your speakers every time you bring them here. But this is one of the great venues and obviously one of the great world affairs organizations in the United States. What I thought I would do today is to follow the guidelines that Frank gave me, and that is to provide you with an overview of the major dimensions of major issues in U.S.-China relations. And then as a way of tying things together, I'm going to turn to that subtitle of my talk, the question of whether we have moved from partners, as Bill Clinton described us, at least potentially, to competitors, as George Bush said we were, and back to partners again. And to forecast my conclusion, I will say that yes, in some ways we are partners, but we are also increasingly competitors at the same time, but in ways that the Bush administration had not anticipated when it coined the phrase of strategic competitor. So as you listen to my talk, I hope that you'll keep these categories in mind, because I'll draw on the dimensions of the relationship when I conclude with that overview of where we've come from and where we may be going. To give a shameless plug for my own institution, the Elliott School of International Affairs at GW, and I can do it because the next speaker is a Georgetown alumna, apparently. Secretary of State Colin Powell, in a speech that marked the opening of our new building in September, very wide-ranging foreign policy speech, described U.S.-China relations as the best they had ever been since then-President Richard Nixon visited China in 1972. Now, that's a difficult comparison to make, and I think it's a bit of an exaggeration. It's a difficult comparison because it's like comparing a first date with a 25-year-old marriage. And to say that the relationship is the best it's been since that first euphoric, romantic first date is a bit of a comparison of apples and oranges, I think. It's also, I think, a bit exaggerated, because if we look at U.S.-China relations and break it apart along its various dimensions, we do see considerable strength and cooperation, indeed partnership in the relationship, but we also see some issues, some of which are familiar, some of which are emerging, and some of which may become more serious if not properly managed in the months and the years ahead. And let me follow convention, the conventional mode of analysis, and talk about four of these issues in no particular order, but I'll start with the political and security dimension. I will then turn to Taiwan, which is closely related. Third, to economics, the trade issue, and finally to human rights. And I hope I keep to that order. As you see, I have no notes, so if I depart from that order, I hope you'll forgive me. With regard to the political or strategic relationship, the Bush administration came into office warning that the United States and China were destined to be strategic competitors. They never really defined what they meant by that. Once they came into office, they emphasized that they didn't necessarily mean an adversarial relationship. But basically what they seemed to imply was a competition for leadership in the region, if not globally, that would be conducted primarily through military deployments and military preparations. Now, those who believed that projection, that forecast, gave somewhat different reasons for their projections. Some of them believed that this was inevitable because China was China, that China had historically been the dominant power of the Asia-Pacific region, the so-called Middle Kingdom, at least as far as the East Asian landmass was concerned, and that China would inevitably, as it became stronger, as it came back after a century or a century and a half of humiliation, that it would try to regain that lost status, and in so doing would try to displace the United States, either entirely or in part, from its dominant position in the Western Pacific. Others believed that the core problem was the nature of the Chinese political system, and that is that whether you call it communist, which I think is increasingly anachronistic, or whether you see it as authoritarian, there was the assumption that that kind of political system would try to mobilize nationalism in order to retain its legitimacy and to remain in power, and that nationalism in turn would inevitably try to push for China having a bigger role, even if through aggressive or assertive means in the region surrounding it. A third interpretation was, and Frank mentioned realism in thinking about foreign policy, the classic realist interpretation, which has nothing to do with history, nothing to do with ideology, nothing to do with political systems, but basically says that when a power rises relative to others, it is going to inevitably enter into a competitive relationship with the hitherto dominant power, and that the challenge of one and the sense of threat of the other is going to lead to strategic competition. So while different members of the, in a sense, the Bush advisory team gave different reasons for their forecast, the basic hypothesis, the basic proposition was that it was inevitable that the US and China would become strategic competitors, perhaps rivals, hopefully not adversaries, in the not too distant future. And the first major comprehensive foreign policy document to come out of the Bush administration, it came out in September 2001, just after September 11th. It was modified slightly as a result of that development, but clearly was written before it. The Quadrennial Defense Review, or QDR, basically suggested that the United States would face this unnamed but unmistakable potential rising power in the Asia-Pacific region. And in order to counterbalance it, the United States would have to increase its military deployments in the Western Pacific. Now, what happened to that rather gloomy vision on the geopolitical dimension? Two things happened. One, which is very obvious, is September 11th. But the second, the earlier one, which I think was equally important, perhaps even more so, was April 1st of 2001. Now, maybe everybody knows September 11th, but how many know what happened on April 1st, 2001? Ooh, we have one of the most informed audience. Oh, there we go. The airplane. Good, very good. This was when the so-called EP3 incident, when an American a Navy electronic reconnaissance aircraft flying in international airspace off the Chinese coast was run into by a Chinese fighter that had come up to try to warn it off, to shoo it away from observing Chinese military deployments or military exercises. And the two planes collided. The Chinese plane crashed into the ocean. The pilot was lost. The EP-3 made a forced and unauthorized emergency landing at a Chinese airbase on Hainan Island in the southeast of China. A very tense, protracted negotiation ensued before the crew and then later the parts, because it had to be disassembled, the parts of the airplane were released. Now, what this incident showed, I think, to both governments was the risks of regarding themselves as strategic competitors, especially given, and I'll talk about this, as I said, second, given rising tensions in the Taiwan Strait. As tensions in the Taiwan Strait grew, the United States became more insistent on finding out what was going on conducting this kind of reconnaissance off the Chinese coast. And as the Americans came closer and closer, more and more frequently, the Chinese military was more aggressive in trying to display its force to try to push the American reconnaissance aircraft back. It was literally an accident waiting to happen, and the accident did, with a tragic loss of life. And what this shows is that when militaries prepare to be strategic competitors, there is always the risk of accident. And the policy adopted by both governments that they are strategic competitors makes it all that more dangerous, more difficult to resolve whatever crises occur. We've seen this at many times in the past, particularly World War I, the most disturbing case of when militaries prepare for war, it often ends up happening even though no one really intended it. So I think that April 1st was a wake-up call to both the Chinese and the American governments that if they regarded themselves as strategic competitors, and if they began to conduct their military, not just their deployments, but their operations in ways that reflected that assessment, that there was a significant chance of military confrontation by accident, and that that would be a highly undesirable development, not just for the United States, but for China too. So I think that that was when both governments decided that they had better back away from this concept of strategic competition and try to find areas of cooperation. But what those areas would be was not so clear. They'd talked about it before. They talked about transnational issues, even talked about terrorism when it was just a remote threat. They talked about non-proliferation, especially in South Asia, but nothing had really been compelling until that second event occurred. and that was September 11th. And after the most short, brief period of hesitation, which we do have to acknowledge existed, the Chinese government decided that this was a threat. September 11th was a threat not only to the United States, but to countries like China as well, particularly perhaps because of the existence of significant numbers of dissatisfied Muslim minorities in the western part of China. And so since then, the United States and China have had a major reason for strategic cooperation, for strategic partnership, really for the first time since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. That's what brought us together strategically. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was no significant common enemy, no issue that really attracted attention, no issue that provided the same amount of strategic glue as had the former Soviet Union. Now suddenly we had one. And while the Chinese have had some reservations about American policy and the war on terror, and while the Chinese have not participated in military operations alongside the United States, in that sense they have not been part of the coalition, in other ways they have been very cooperative, and their cooperation has been regularly and rather enthusiastically acknowledged by the United States government. So as we work together in the war on terror, working to try to staunch the flow of financial resources to terrorist organizations, sharing intelligence, urging the Pakistani government of General Musharraf to cooperate to try to shut down terrorist operations in his country, trying to ensure the security of container shipping, and in general, mobilizing the other countries of the Asia-Pacific region to cooperate in this common struggle. All of this represents an area of significant strategic cooperation between the United States and China. More recently, there has been a second and equally important and somewhat related area of security cooperation, and that is on the Korean Peninsula, where the Chinese have gradually but significantly shifted their perception, and now I think are just as concerned about the dangers of North Korea's nuclear weapons program as the United States has been, and increasingly for the same reasons. And there's some code words in there. If you want to ask me, for the sake of time, I won't go into the ways in which there's been this convergence. But basically, as the Chinese, or to paraphrase a famous Chinese saying, previously we had been in the same bed with different nightmares about the North Korean nuclear program. Now it's the same bed and the same nightmare, as basically what would happen if North Korea started a war, or what would happen more likely if North Korea tried to peddle its weapons of mass destruction or its missile capabilities to the highest bidder, and how those weapons might be used or might be threatened. So I think it's for this reason, the abandonment of the idea of strategic cooperation and the return to the concept of strategic competition, and the return to the concept of strategic cooperation, focused on the war on terror and on the North Korean nuclear weapons program, that has led people like Secretary Powell to praise U.S.-China relations as the best they have been in more than 30 years. However, having said that, if we look a little bit deeper, we do see areas still of disagreement here. As I said, the Chinese do not agree with every aspect of the American war on terror. To sum up the major differences, they would be: number one, greater sympathy for the idea that the United States and other countries should deal with the question of root causes of grievance and dissatisfaction in the Islamic world and elsewhere. Number two, a great concern about the strategy of preventive war and coercive regime change in countries like Iraq. And number three, and very closely relatedly, much greater insistence that the United States and other countries work through the United Nations and other multilateral organizations rather than acting unilaterally. So that while these differences have been contained in the case of Iraq, If this were to happen again, then the Chinese disagreements with the United States might be more severe. On Korea, too, there is a common objective, but emerging differences over specific goals and, above all, over strategy. Basically, the question here is, what should we demand of North Korea? How demanding should we be in the inspection process to ensure that they've lived up to their commitments? What, if anything, are we prepared to pay them in order to secure a deal? And number 4, what are we prepared to do to punish them if they violate it? And again, without going into the details, let's simply say that the Chinese and the South Koreans have somewhat different answers to many of these questions than do the Americans and the Japanese. And that as the situation goes on without an agreement reached, my concern is that some of these differences are going to grow over time. At a minimum, the Chinese will present themselves as a mediator between North Korea and the United States, as opposed to a partner of the United States in dealing with North Korea. And at a maximum, there could be increasingly severe differences between the United States and China over the terms of an agreement. This would be particularly dangerous if it were to occur, that is, divisions over the Korean question, at the same time as serious tensions in the Taiwan Strait. And that, of course, is the second element of U.S.-China relations, and in fact one that goes back to the end of the Civil War in 1949. As you know, the United States has tried to balance its desire to maintain a peaceful future for Taiwan, freedom to have a voice in its own destiny on the one hand, and the desire to avoid conflict with China on the other. And in pursuing that twin set of competing objectives, different administrations have, in a sense, vacillated over time, tilted back and forth. The Bush administration came into office criticizing not only the Clinton administration's notion of China as a strategic partner of the United States, but also came into office criticizing the Clinton administration's policy towards Taiwan. And again, to make a long story short, it basically indicated that it would be much more supportive of the young democracy on Taiwan with regard to, first, being willing to sell more weapons to Taiwan, more arms, up to and including ballistic missile defense systems in order to help it defend itself against the threat of missile attack from across the Taiwan Strait. Secondly, that it would increase the level of official contact between the United States and Taiwan, up to including more visits by Taiwanese presidents to the United States, although officially in transit status. Thirdly, that there would be greater interoperability of the Taiwanese and the U.S. militaries in case there was an attack that the United States needed to assist Taiwan in defending against, and perhaps finally some interest in a free trade area between the United States and Taiwan. Now, what has happened over the last several months since the Bush administration came into office has been, I think, a pulling back of the tilt towards Taiwan to a more centrist position that represents the kind of the average American policy towards Taiwan. This has happened for a variety of reasons. First, the United States and the American business community, and I just came back from Taiwan a couple of weeks ago, and I heard this firsthand. The American business community is increasingly dissatisfied with the business climate on Taiwan. It remains, perhaps for understandable reasons, because it regards itself as a society under siege, under threat from the mainland. It remains a highly regulated economy in a region that elsewhere is liberalizing. This is still a permit economy, where quite literally everything is prohibited unless it is permitted. And so you have to go around and get chops, get stamps, get approval if you want to start or significantly expand a business on Taiwan. There are serious problems with violation of intellectual property rights on Taiwan. And for simply economic reasons, the idea that it would be feasible to have a free trade agreement with an economy that was so regulated and had such problems with IPR, that concept began to lose favor, let alone the political argument that this would irritate Beijing. Secondly, as the Americans and the Taiwanese really began to explore the implications of the interoperability of their armed forces and began to really probe the question of what the Taiwanese would actually buy of the long list of advanced weapon systems that they had requested, also dissatisfaction grew. It turned out that Taiwan was not prepared to actually put money up to buy what it had requested, partly because of the obvious budgetary considerations, but partly because their intention had always been to get the United States to make a political gesture by offering to sell, when Taiwan would never have to make the economic commitment of actually agreeing to buy. And this led to one of the most long-standing issues in U.S.-Taiwan relations, that if there were a crisis in the Taiwan Strait, would Taiwan really play a major role in its own self-defense? Or would the idea be that it would hold the American coat while Washington and Beijing duked it out? And that's one of the longest-standing issues in the relationship. It's why the Bush administration has significantly shifted its rhetoric from doing whatever it would take to defend Taiwan to talking about assisting Taiwan in its self-defense, with the emphasis on self. And finally, the United States was concerned that as it made these friendly gestures to the democratically elected government of President Chen Shui-bian on Taiwan, that Chen pushed the opening for all it was worth, in terms not only of having a very highly visible visit to the United States, including New York in last year, but also putting forward the idea of a referendum, and in fact a series of referenda that might ultimately lead to a new constitution that might conceivably represent a declaration of independence from China in some way, perhaps the most provocative thing that any Taiwanese government could ever do, and certainly would be a casus belli from the Chinese perspective. So for all these reasons, the United States, having tilted quite far towards Taiwan in 2001, has begun to come back to the center, and maybe even a little bit beyond. And in December of last year, in receiving the Chinese Prime Minister Wen Jiabao in the White House, President Bush made it very clear that he was extremely unhappy with the Taiwanese president, referring to him not by name or by title, but as the leader of Taiwan, precisely the same nomenclature that the Chinese mainland uses, and made it very clear that he was opposed to the referendum because it threatened to disrupt the status quo in the Taiwan Strait. Now, having said this, that we're kind of back again in that mainstream of a more even-handed approach to Taiwan and the mainland, the problem is, over the longer term, what we have now is what I see as a situation of competing nationalisms on both sides of the Taiwan Strait. And by that, the word nationalism, I simply mean the question of identity and territory. Who are we, and what is the status of the territory that we occupy? For the Chinese, Taiwanese are Chinese, and the island of Taiwan should be part of China. That's Chinese nationalism. On the other side of the Taiwan Strait, however, there is a growing Taiwanese nationalism that says Taiwanese are descended from Chinese, but they are no longer Chinese. They are Taiwanese. And Taiwan is therefore not part of China, but should be an independent sovereign territory, should be its own state. Now, these are not only mutually exclusive concepts, but because they are nationalisms, they are very emotional, and they're very difficult to manage. And so the basic problem that the United States is going to face in its dealing with China over the Taiwan issue is that there is no longer the comfortable idea, the comfortable consensus that eventually Taiwan and China are going to be unified, eventually the issue can be solved. All the United States has to do is to prevent a crisis from emerging, buy time, and let nature take its course. Now, if nature takes its course, it may actually move towards separation and confrontation. And so while the situation today is an example of U.S.-China strategic cooperation to dampen down the Taiwan issue, the prospects for the longer term still have to be quite worrying for those who follow U.S.-China relations. Now, one of the things that more optimistic, and I haven't been that pessimistic, I hope. I want you to enjoy the rest of the evening and have a good night's sleep. I don't want to scare you out of that. But what many of the optimists in talking about the Taiwan Strait and other issues often point to is the enormous economic interdependence that is linking the more vibrant economies of the world, including Taiwan and China, but also including the United States and China. And certainly that is very visible with regard to Taiwan. Taiwan probably has at any given time as many as 1 or 2 million of its residents on the mainland, some in long-term residence and some traveling either for business or for pleasure. And given that the population of Taiwan is somewhere in the neighborhood of the low 20 million, say 22, 23 million, something like that, that is an extraordinary percentage. And of course, that reflects the growing investment and trade ties across the Taiwan Strait. And so the optimists say, well, how can two countries that are so economically interdependent ever have problems and ever go to war? And that same factor gives people optimism about U.S.-China relations too, because the American, while we don't have that many people visiting the mainland at any given time, we have a lot, and we still have a lot of Chinese visitors and students and scholars and business people here, and tourists increasingly, here in the United States. And yet what we have seen is that that economic interdependence does not necessarily make us entirely economic partners, as the Bush administration again had said when it came into office in 2001, but can, if that trade or that economic relationship is seen by either side as unfair or imbalanced, can be a significant source of tension, not necessarily conflict, but tension in the relationship. So again, the dramatic change since 2001. The Bush administration came into office saying, as I mentioned before, that the U.S. and China were already strategic competitors. But it qualified that by saying, but we're not adversaries and we are economic partners. And of course, in many ways we are. But what is fascinating on this issue is the explosive emergence of U.S.-China economic ties as a major problem in the relationship, beginning really in the fall of last year, dying down somewhat now, but very possibly going to be reactivated by the presidential election campaign of 2004. And basically the issue is, of course, the huge Chinese trade surplus with the United States that also is linked to the growing sense that China is taking away manufacturing jobs from the American economy, and that it is doing all of this by unfair trading practices. So in the latter part of 2003, you had a steady drumbeat of criticisms of China and its trade practices and its trade surplus with the United States, including from parts of the business community that had hitherto been very supportive of the U.S.-China relationship, had been one of the strongest defenders of maintaining a stable tie between Washington and Beijing, including the most notable example, the National Association of Manufacturers. And basically they began to argue that China was engaged in unfair trade practices, the single most important of which was an undervalued Chinese currency that made Chinese goods excessively and unrealistically cheap for American consumers and made American exports to China inappropriately dear. Now, the Bush administration struggled to try to get ahead of this issue, to try to co-opt it, but to try to move it in ways that it thought would be more appropriate to the problem and would be less disruptive to the U.S.-China relationship. So what did it do? It basically championed the critics' call for a revaluation of the Chinese currency, but modified it in significant ways. And if this is too much technical economics, don't worry, I'll be past this issue very quickly. Basically, instead of doing what the critics had proposed, which was pushing the Chinese simply to adjust their exchange rate upward, the Bush administration said, well, we don't believe in adjusted exchange rate movements. We believe in floating currencies. So the Chinese should float their currency. If they do so, it will appreciate naturally, and the same result will be achieved. But at the same time, and the Bush administration also was able to say that the Chinese, in theory, have that objective of a purely floating exchange rate at some point in the future. But the Bush administration then went on to acknowledge the Chinese argument that this cannot happen quickly. It will take time to have the preconditions where the currency of China can float without significant risk or disruption to the Chinese economy. And so basically the Bush administration was willing to, in effect, take the position of the appreciation of the Chinese currency, but not now. When you get around to it, when you're ready to float your exchange rate and allow it to occur by natural means. Now, this spoke to the issue of exchange rate, but it obviously, by pushing off the solution into the indefinite future, it didn't solve the problem. So the Bush administration has also had two other elements of its strategy of dealing with the Chinese trade surplus. Number one is to push harder on the Chinese to live up to their market opening obligations under the World Trade Organization accession agreement. And if you look at the Bush administration's statements last year and compare them to the year before, you will see a significantly increased level of attention to this issue and increased criticism of China's performance, of course echoed by the American business community, both in China and back in the United States. And the American government has begun to single out certain Chinese exports for retaliatory actions under the WTO, the so-called anti-dumping and market disruption provisions, particularly various kinds of textiles, and now, if you saw, I think it was the New York Times this morning, demands from the furniture industry for similar anti-dumping provisions against Chinese furniture exports to the United States. Now, the Chinese have also tried to manage this issue in their own way. They send what they always send, buying missions to the United States, focusing on Boeing and Boeing aircraft, because you write one check for one purchase, and it's a heck of a lot of money. A couple of Boeing 747s and 757s and so they call it 7E7s, the new Boeings that are coming down the line. A couple of purchases of these babies, and you've made a big dent in the annual trade deficit. Of course, you don't have to do anything structurally other than write the check, which is why it's so easy to do. So it doesn't have the same kind of political payoff that the Chinese would like, except in Washington State and the aircraft industry. But still, it is a step forward. The other thing the Chinese have proposed is to say, you know, there are certain other things that we'd love to buy that you won't sell, like high tech and weapons. So how about relaxing your restrictions on those, and we'll buy a lot of them. They've begun to make that case successfully with the French, but not yet with the Americans. So we're in a process of complex discussion with the Chinese, some management devices for dealing with this issue, and tensions are down significantly than they were, say, 6 months ago. But the issue has not gone away, and we're in an election campaign that is taking place in a period of great economic uncertainty and in the midst of a jobless recovery. In a sense that the Chinese are basically eating everybody's lunch with regard to their competitiveness with regard to manufactured exports. So this issue could well come up again, either for political reasons or if for economic reasons if recovery is slow. Finally, let me deal in my survey of these 4 issues with human rights and then turn to my conclusion about competitor or partner or what. The human rights issue in U.S.-China relations declined significantly in its visibility when the Bush administration came into office. Because the Bush administration came into office saying that it would have a less arrogant, that was its word, arrogant approach to Asia, and that basically meant human rights. So that while there remains concern in the parts of the U.S. government that have a institutional responsibility for this issue, such as the Human Rights Office of the State Department that your next speaker supervises, or whether it's Congress, or whether it's human rights organizations outside the government, generally speaking, this has been a much lower-keyed issue. And that's partly true, too, because there have been fewer visible, big problems with regard to human rights. No more Tiananmens, basically a more thorough and therefore increasingly less visible suppression of unauthorized religious groups such as Falun Gong, and some progress in building a society that has somewhat greater consultative mechanisms and somewhat greater rule of law. So the Chinese are moving in some ways towards political reform, and that has contributed too to the calming down of the human rights issue. But in recent months, it has begun to come up again with regard to a particular corner of China, and that corner is Hong Kong. And it basically has come up in two ways. Two provisions of that basic law, the mini-constitution that governs Hong Kong under Chinese sovereignty after it left British control in 1997. One part of the basic law, Article 23, provides that Hong Kong will enact anti-subversion laws. Now, many countries have anti-subversion laws, and of course, in the days of the American Patriot Act, USA Patriot Act, we're now familiar with more than we were in the past with the perceived necessity for this kind of legislation. So the question is really as much what kind of law rather than whether or not to have one. But without getting into the details, the proposal that the Hong Kong government put forward, acting on its own to meet the requirement of the basic law, under some prompting from Beijing that it was now time to actually get moving on this issue, caused some of the largest anti-government protests in Hong Kong that that territory has ever seen on July 1 of last year. And so powerful was the voice of the Hong Kong people that the Hong Kong government backed away, rescinded its proposal. It was clear it was not going to get it through the legislature, and basically said, we'll try again later at some unspecified date to be determined. Well, that seemed to be a victory, but it quickly changed the issue to the other provisions of the basic law that have to do with the evolution of the fundamental governing structure of Hong Kong, the legislature and the chief executive. And again, without going into all of the details, let's simply say that in a few years' time, the basic law provides the possibility, but not the necessity, that both the chief executive and the entire legislative council of Hong Kong will be directly elected, entirely democratic, one man, one vote. And basically because of the demonstrations last year, the Chinese government has now made it clear that it would like the Hong Kong government to delay, to go very slowly, to use the various loopholes and ambiguities of the basic law, not to push to the outer limit of what's constitutionally possible, but to be more at the bottom of the lower limit. And that sense that China is interfering to try to delay democratic reform and impose anti-subversion law is, of course, becoming an issue in U.S.-China relations, because the United States is saying that it disapproves of this, and the Chinese are responding by saying, it's none of your damn business. Hong Kong is now part of China. So is Secretary Powell right in saying that it's the best relationship since 1972? As I said, it's a difficult comparison to make because it was such a superficial and almost empty, non-existent relationship. Certainly we see a healthy, a growing sense of cooperation on many security issues, but many uncertainties with regard to Korea and Taiwan and other issues. We see many benefiting from economic relations with China, but many threatened. And we see human rights as a chronic irritant in the relationship, with more immediate concerns, acute concerns, rising over the issue of Hong Kong. So, have we gone from strategic partner to strategic competitor and back again? Well, the Clinton administration never actually said that China was our strategic partner. It said that that was its objective, to make it one. And in fact, in many ways, the Bush administration has achieved that objective. It actually has followed the Clinton administration policy of building toward a constructive strategic partnership. And on many issues, it has achieved success. But we see other areas in which China and the United States are already or potentially in a competitive relationship. And let me conclude by simply ticking off two that I'm pretty confident I see, and a third that I hope we will not enter. The one that I already see is economics. It was amazing for the Bush administration to say that we were strategic competitors but economic partners. Actually, it was just the opposite. We're strategic partners but economic competitors. And the Chinese are competing with the rest of the world in more and more areas because basically the technology and the production capacity and the design capacity and the marketing ability are transferred to China far more rapidly than China's wage rates are rising because of that huge pool of hardworking, relatively well-educated, and enormously inexpensive labor. So we are seeing China competing not just with us, but with everybody. And in fact, what Americans have to understand is that the jobs that China is taking away probably have already been taken away long ago, or if they weren't, they would have been taken away by someone else, by the Taiwanese, by the Koreans, by the Vietnamese, by the Bangladeshis, by the Indians. It's a competitive world, but China is a very good example of the kind of competitive pressure that American workers are going to be facing. And ladies and gentlemen, it's not just going to be blue-collar workers anymore. It's going to be white-collar workers. It's going to be people who process ideas but who do not require face-to-face contact with their clients. So those people who have been, I hope I don't scare anybody in the room, have been accountants, for example, or data processors, or even tech support people, will find that those functions can be done by a well-educated, fluent English speaker in Bangalore, India, far cheaper than it can be done here in Baltimore. So this is not just going to be a China problem, it's going to be an India problem, it's going to be a global problem. But the bottom line is that while there's going to be a lot of partnership between Chinese and American businesses, there's going to be a lot of competition as well. The second area of competition is a political competition. And it's a very different one than the critics of China forecast when the Bush administration came into power. They had the idea of kind of a China on the march, a China that, whose goose-stepping soldiers would start preparing for war against its neighbors. And in fact, what we are seeing is a very different kind of competition. What we're seeing is the competition from China that has suddenly adopted a far more liberal foreign policy than the United States has, and one that thereby is attracting a great deal of interest and sympathy in other parts of its own region. The question I often ask people is, which astronaut, whose country's astronaut most recently carried into space not only his own flag, but the UN flag? Hint, it was not an American. Answer, it was the Chinese astronaut. China is showing an increasing interest in multilateral cooperation. It's showing an increasing interest in forming free trade agreements with its neighbors. It is talking increasingly about cooperative security to deal with transnational issues. It's more and more proactive in suggesting solutions to international problems. It is increasingly exercising its soft power with regard not only to diplomacy, but increasingly to its culture. In all these ways, it is engaging in what I call a liberal foreign policy. And that is increasingly of appeal to countries in Asia. And it is a time when the United States is probably one of the rare times in its history when it is carrying out a thoroughly realist foreign policy, a muscular foreign policy that may be more effective in some ways, but doesn't tend to arouse that warm and fuzzy sympathy that liberal goals and ideals tend to do. Perhaps the most alarming example of this competition occurred when the Chinese president, Hu Jintao, and the American president, George Bush, visited Canberra, Australia within a few days apart. Both spoke to the Australian Parliament. Both did press conferences. And again, guess who was far better received by the Australian press and the Australian public? And it was not the American. And this was from our staunchest ally in the Asia-Pacific region, and it was from a partner that contributed, along with the Americans and the British, underappreciated and acknowledged combat troops to the war in Iraq. Now again, I don't want to be alarmist, and I don't want to exaggerate the extent to which the Chinese are actually liberal in either their domestic or their foreign policy. But the fact of the matter is that they are moving in more liberal directions at the same time that America is moving away from its liberal directions in international affairs. And that presents a competition that Americans are only dimly aware of. Those who talk about competition with China in the non-economic sense are still talking about a China that throws its weight around. That kind of a China, ladies and gentlemen, is far easier for us to deal with if we're competing with them, because they'll be seen as a threat by others. It may be costly, it may be hard, but we know how to deal with that. What is much more difficult to deal with is a political competitor that outmaneuvers the United States with regard to presenting itself as a constructive, cooperative, peaceful power that is linked to a rising economy. That is not something we've had to face before. In fact, you could argue that that's what, to some degree, the British faced with American competition at the beginning of the last century and had to yield to, because they could not compete with it. Now, the competition that I hope does not exist is strategic competition. In other words, that the two countries actually do get involved in an arms race. Given our preoccupation with the war on terror, and given that cooperative Chinese foreign policy, that liberal foreign policy, it seems to be unlikely, at least for the immediate and foreseeable future. So I don't think we're going to face the kind of competition that President Bush warned of when he came into office, a strategic competition with China. But alongside the very real partnership that exists, I think we are already seeing economic competition that the American economy is going to have to deal with in order to maintain the standards of living for the American people. It's a competition that's not just with China, but with all other successful, large, developing economies. And increasingly, we are engaged in a subtle political competition as to vision and leadership for the Asia-Pacific region. So are we competitors or partners? We're both. And clearly, we want to build on the partnership. We have to wage the competition wisely. And we certainly want to try as best we can to avoid a strategic competition that would mean at best a Cold War and at worst a hot war with one of the world's rising major powers. Thanks very much. Thank you. The question is, what do I think about the relations between China and Japan? And the questioner has talked to people who have misgivings, and I said, me too, and I think for good reasons. Basically, all of the sort of classic recipes for problem are there. I talked earlier about the idea that China was a rising power and the United States is a status quo power, and how that's a recipe in realist theory for tension. But before it competes with the United States, China's going to compete with Japan a lot sooner. And so there's where that competition is really clear. I was in Japan just after the Chinese sent the astronaut with the two flags up into space, and I can tell you the shockwaves that it sent in Japan. That basically this was something the Chinese had done that the Japanese have not yet done. They probably could do it easily enough, but they haven't done it, the fact is. And this was a shockwave. So you have this sense of a shifting balance between a resurgent China and a relatively stagnant Japan. You also have competing nationalisms there too, although of a different sort. It basically is competing interpretations of history, and particularly the Japanese attack on China in what the Chinese call the anti-Japanese war, the pre-World War II period, and then through World War II. Totally different interpretations of specific events and of the general pattern of history. And third, you do have some territorial disputes, not major ones, but again, some disputes that can become flashpoints. Now, against that, you have a situation that neither country wants trouble, and there is enormous economic interdependence. So again, the forecasts are mixed. But still, if you asked me what set of major power relationships in East Asia I would worry about most, in fact, it would not be US-China, it would be China-Japan, for the reasons that I have just mentioned. The question is, doing foreign policy is easier when you have a controlled and docile population, and given that, what are the prospects for democracy in China, which would presumably complicate their foreign policy? Well, I'd say that on the basis of my visits to China over the years, it is an incompletely controlled and rarely docile population. This is a very feisty population. And I think that the prospects actually for freedom are far greater than the prospects for democracy. Those are two very different things. And basically, freedom simply means the government leaves you alone. Democracy means that you are able to shape government policy with regard to those areas of life that it continues to regulate, or, to use your word, control. And I would say that China, and one can, have a long discussion of whether this conforms with some cultural proclivities in China. We're seeing China move far faster towards freedom than towards democracy. But what that means is you are beginning to have an independent public opinion on foreign policy in China. And believe it or not, that is a public opinion that in general, not entirely, it's a wide spectrum. In a billion, well, even if you take down to sort of maybe 200 million, the size of the United States, 250 million relatively politically aware Chinese, say the middle class in the eastern cities, you're probably going to have every range of view imaginable. But a significant portion of that is critical of the Chinese government for not standing up to the United States, for being too friendly, too accommodating, indeed too liberal in its foreign policy. So what I would warn against is the idea that a democratic China is going to be a friendlier China. I would argue that given some of the problems that I've mentioned, a more democratic China could be a more assertive China and could challenge the United States, particularly on issues such as Taiwan, and possibly on the whole question of the balance of power in Asia. Because China today, as part of its liberal policy, is no longer saying we want the United States out of Asia as an immediate demand. A different kind of government, more responsive to Chinese nationalism, might begin to raise that again. So the prospects for freedom are greater, that freedom is producing a wide range of opinion on foreign policy, that because of the controls, the authoritarian nature of the regime, the Chinese government can resist, and at the expense of seeming to be anti-democratic, I would say, thank God.